Welcome to the Sprout Out Loud podcast. I'm your host, Allie McGowan, a registered dietitian on a mission to help others navigate confusing nutrition information. Each week, we'll explore practical strategies for improving metabolic health and building lifestyle habits that support lasting change. My goal is to equip you with the tools and insights to take control of your health and make informed choices that work for you. All right, welcome to part 2 of this episode where I am talking about how protein supports hormonal health. So last time I touched on why protein is important for everyone, not just for folks who are pursuing weight loss or for people who are bodybuilders. And I touched on the role of protein in other things like immune function, hormone production, blood sugar support, and even things like our hair, skin, and nails. So I focused a lot on how protein supports hormonal health last episode, specifically how protein supports things like blood sugar control and how that affects our hormones. I also talked about how protein supports lean body mass and how having lean body mass can also have an impact on our hormonal health. So if you haven't listened to that first episode yet, I recommend starting there. And then I also called out a couple of other resources that I have on protein for anyone who's sort of interested in learning more about this topic. So I do have a blog post that talks a little bit more about the other roles that protein plays beyond just hormonal health. I touch on things like protein quality, so sort of the difference between animal-based proteins and plant-based proteins. I also talk about some different recommendations for protein based on someone's goals. So in that blog post, there is a chart that can help you sort of get a good starting point or a good understanding of what your protein needs may be, depending on your goals. And that chart is really meant to be a general starting point. And so this is where working with a dietitian or someone else who is specialized in this area to figure out what your unique protein needs are can be quite helpful. That chart is just helpful for sort of illustrating that if you have different goals, your protein needs may look a little bit different than someone else's. And then in that post, I also outline some tips for increasing your protein intake. So if that is of interest to you, you can find that blog post linked in the show notes here. And then I do also have a free guide on foods that are high in protein. If you're sort of unsure on what foods are going to be an efficient source of protein, what foods might be higher or lower in protein. And so the link to that free e-guide is also in the show notes here. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, the information shared on the Sprout Out Loud podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Always consult with your healthcare provider before making changes to your diet or lifestyle. So today I'm going to focus on why protein is definitely important, but how it shouldn't displace other nutrients, both for general health, but also, again, keeping in this theme of hormonal health. And so protein, again, has been getting a lot of hype. We see it in a lot of products. There's things like protein chips and protein bagels, protein breads, protein spreads. If you're on social media, I feel like cottage cheese is in everything nowadays. And while protein is definitely important, especially if you listened to that last episode, we know that it's not the only thing that we should be thinking about. And there sort of is this point of diminishing returns, I would say, where once we're meeting our protein needs, more isn't inherently better, especially if it's sort of crowding out these other nutrients that are going to be really supportive of health. They're going to be really supportive of hormone health and also just keeping a balanced, healthy relationship with food. If meeting our protein needs means that we are not getting a good mix of things like carbs and fiber and healthy fats, or if we're sort of just dreading our meals because they're so high in protein and that's not leaving space for other foods that we enjoy, well then more, again, isn't inherently better. And this is where I really think it's an empowering thing to understand what your protein needs are. In my personal experience and in my work with hundreds of people now, I will say that not getting enough protein isn't a great feeling. And a lot of times we may not notice this effect until we start getting enough protein. For many people, getting enough protein is going to look and feel like having a more manageable level of appetite, having steadier energy, reducing the instance of overeating because you've been managing your appetite by getting enough protein in at your meals. And a lot of times what I see is people might be meeting their protein goal for the day, but if we take a look at how they're building their meals, that protein intake may not be dispersed evenly throughout the day. So this could look like a low protein breakfast, a semi-moderate protein intake at lunch, and then a really, really high protein intake at the end of the day, maybe at dinner, maybe with some snacks after dinner. And so in these instances, again, someone might be taking in their protein goal for the day, but because protein is so helpful for managing our appetite, and when I say that protein helps to manage our appetite, I mean it literally helps to release hormones that suppress our appetite, but also protein is going to have that stabilizing effect on our blood sugar. So if we are not getting protein in earlier in the day, then we're also not getting those benefits. And so a lot of times our hunger may sort of build in the background throughout the day. And our blood sugar may be sort of out of whack in the background throughout the day as well. And a lot of times this tends to show up, somewhere in the afternoon or in the evening for some people, where they may say, I'm really not hungry earlier on in the day, but come, when I finish work or come dinner time, that's when I'm really hungry. And we take a look at their meals, and again, maybe that protein is not being put into their meals earlier in the day. And then it sort of becomes this perpetual cycle where we're eating most of our food at night, and then that will lend to not feeling hungry in the morning. Going on a tangent here, but again, that protein is something we do want to consider putting in most of our meals as best as we can. And this is where thinking about like a general framework for your meals can be helpful as well. Once we've checked that protein box, we should move on to other things like fiber, carbs, and healthy fats. And that is what I'm going to be talking about now. More protein isn't going to be beneficial if it's preventing us from getting in enough calories because it's so filling or because it's the most filling. And I'll touch on how that applies to weight loss. Protein also isn't going to be, or more protein isn't going to be more helpful if it's displacing carbs, fiber, or healthy fats. And I'll touch on each one of those things individually. And then more protein isn't necessarily going to be helpful if that requires us to take in a lot of protein supplements and prevents us from getting protein from whole food sources. And now I'm not anti-supplement. I'm not anti-protein supplements. I think they certainly play a role in many people's journeys, but we don't want to create a situation in which someone is getting all of their protein needs met by bars, shakes, powders, and we're not taking in enough of that protein from food sources. Okay, so we will start with calories first. So in the last episode, I talked a lot about how protein supports lean body mass and how lean body mass helps with things like blood sugar. It can even help support the body in clearing excess hormones and preventing that situation called estrogen dominance that I talked about. But we also need to have enough body fat to support hormone health, especially for women. And so if we're eating too much protein and it lends us to feeling too full, and then we can't eat enough calories, then our body fat drops too low as a result, well, then this is the point of sort of diminishing returns where more protein isn't inherently better when we take a look at the whole picture of our health. Now, getting enough protein is going to be a focus area for someone who is on a weight loss journey. But again, the focus of this episode is really on hormonal health. So very quickly at a high level, when we're losing weight, we do want to make sure that the weight that we're losing is coming primarily from fat mass and not from muscle mass. And so one of the ways that we do that is we make sure that if we are in a calorie deficit, we're at least meeting our protein needs. Going back to how protein helps to preserve that lean body mass, our protein needs will actually increase during weight loss so that protein can do its job in managing our muscle mass. Again, protein is going to help to manage our appetite, maybe prevent some cravings, but to support sustainable weight loss, we want to, number one, make sure that our rate of weight loss is safe and healthy so that we're not risking that loss of lean body mass or even putting ourselves at risk for something like micronutrient deficiencies. And if having too much protein leads to eating dramatically and our rate of weight loss is too high, well, then we might need to pull back on that protein to make room for other foods that might be less filling so that we can get adequate calories in. Another big component of sustainable weight loss is sustainable habits, right? So throughout the process of weight loss, we want to be focusing on building habits that support that steady weight loss, but also that support weight maintenance. And if we think about building balanced meals, if our meals are really skewed towards protein, that's not going to be sustainable long term. So again, there is this point where more protein, if it's reducing our intake of just calories in general too much, and that leads us to rapid weight loss or just building habits that aren't sustainable, well, then we would want to pull back on that protein because it's the most filling nutrient to make room for those other nutrients that might slow down our rate of weight loss. And again, just help us build those sustainable eating patterns that would support weight maintenance down the line as well. Next, if protein is displacing our intake of fiber, and that fiber is going to come from things like fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, whole grains, then we are definitely missing out on other foods that are going to support good hormone health. So fiber is going to play a key role in feeding the gut microbiome and supporting healthy digestion. So we know that we have probiotics, which are our quote unquote good gut bacteria. And then we also have prebiotics, which are essentially the food or the fuel to help those probiotics or that good bacteria flourish. Fiber is actually going to act as a prebiotic to support those good gut bacteria or to feed those probiotics. And so we do know that our gut health plays a really big role in immune and hormone health. So for example, our gut bacteria or our gut helps to detoxify excess estrogen. And so that can help to prevent that situation of estrogen dominance that we talked about. And fiber-rich foods are also going to play a really big role in that blood sugar control. So fiber is actually going to slow down how quickly a meal digests, and that's going to help to blunt our blood sugar response so that our blood sugar sort of rises and falls more slowly over a longer period of time. And I touched on how that blood sugar control or that, keeping blood sugar stable affects hormone health in the last episode. Beyond just hormone health, fiber also plays a really big role in helping to manage cholesterol. And so when we eat fiber, specifically soluble fiber, which just dissolves in water, it actually forms this gel-like substance. So that gel-like substance that forms when we eat fiber actually binds to cholesterol and helps excrete or remove that cholesterol from the body because we actually eliminate that in our stool. Plant-based foods like fruits and vegetables also have these natural compounds called plant sterols, and these actually help to block cholesterol absorption because they look very similar to cholesterol. So plant sterol has the word sterile, cholesterol has the word sterile. And so when we eat these plant-based foods, they look very similar to cholesterol and they actually compete for absorption. And so this is going to help to lower our LDL cholesterol or bad cholesterol because it's going to prevent the body from absorbing that bad cholesterol without affecting our HDL or our good cholesterol. So having that fiber intake in our meals and throughout the week is really going to help to support that gut health, that blood sugar control. Both of those things support hormonal health and also just keeping healthy cholesterol levels, which has a slew of benefits for our metabolic health in general. And then of course that fiber is going to help to keep us regular. So for someone who struggles with things like constipation or bloating, making sure that we're getting a good amount of fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, those whole grains, so things like quinoa, buckwheat, chickpeas, lentils, beans, legumes, all of those things are going to help with just keeping you regular as well. Okay, next, if our protein intake is displacing our intake of carbs, that also may not be beneficial if you care about your hormone health. And I see this a lot when people are sort of maybe overeating protein and not getting enough of those carbs in, and they might be feeling things like low energy, maybe their digestion suffers, so on and so forth. And so when we talk about carbs, we often say that carbs are your body's preferred source of fuel. You've probably heard this before. We know that the brain, the nervous system, these parts of the body love carbs, and especially if you're someone who does high intensity activity, carbs are definitely going to be your friend. But when we say that carbs are the preferred source of fuel for the body, we mean that if you are not consuming adequate carbs, the body will literally go through a process of taking amino acids from protein and turning them into glucose. And so basically this just illustrates that the body will go to great lengths to create that glucose from other sources if we are not getting that glucose from carbohydrate-rich foods. So if we are cutting out carbs or if we're reducing our carbs too low in favor of protein, then we may be experiencing things like energy crashes, mood swings, poor recovery from exercise. Carbs also help to spare protein. So again, if we're not getting enough carbs, the body will take some amino acids from protein and turn them into glucose. When we are getting enough carbs, the body won't go through that process. And that means that protein can function as protein. And one of the functions of protein is muscle building. And so if we have muscle building goals and we're also not consuming enough carbs, well, then we may notice that it's actually much more difficult to put on muscle. And going back to how having lean body mass supports hormonal health, well, we can sort of see how carbs would play into all of that. Also carbs, more of those fiber-rich carbs specifically, those also help to support that blood sugar control by giving the body the energy that it maybe prefers. But if we're having that fiber built into those carbs, that's going to be a slower drip of energy or more favorable blood sugar response. And so an example of a fiber-rich carb or a complex carb would be something like sweet potato, oats, fruit. These foods have that fiber sort of naturally packaged in them versus, a more simple carb has that fiber removed. That could look like apple juice even. We don't have that fiber that's going to slow down how quickly that food digests or how quickly our blood sugar rises. Things like soda, pastries, even white bread or refined bread. And we can add fiber sources to these foods to slow down that response as well. Next, if our protein intake is preventing us from getting enough fat, that may also have an impact on our hormonal health as well. So we know that fat is the building blocks of our hormones, and fats are really essential for making steroid hormones like estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, and testosterone. So if we're sort of under eating fat, we may see things like dry skin, fatigue, low sex drive, but also amenorrhea or loss of your period. We may also struggle to absorb certain fat-soluble vitamins. Vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble, and that means that we actually need dietary fats to absorb them. These vitamins play a role in things like immunity, but also thyroid and fertility health as well. So we definitely need that dietary fat to support that good hormone health because, again, fat is sort of like the building block for these steroid hormones that play a role in things like fertility and thyroid health. And then last but not least, if we are sort of leveraging protein supplements or overusing them to meet our protein needs, then we might be missing out on the benefits of these other foods, but also just the benefits of whole food protein sources. So when we eat a food that is high in protein, let's take chicken breast for example, we get the protein from that food, but we'll also get a lot of the micronutrients that are sort of naturally packaged in that food. So for example, we might get some omega-3 fatty acids from chicken breast as well. Beyond that though, food sources of protein are going to have a different effect on how satisfied we feel after eating. So something like a chicken breast, I'll just stick with that example, that's going to require us to sort of like cut and chew and swallow that food. That is going to slow us down during meal times, so we might actually have more time to sort of mentally process or give the brain time to process what we just ate. It's also going to take a little bit longer to digest, because the body's going to sort of need to exert a little bit more effort to break down that food, versus if we were to get the same amount of protein from something like a protein shake, which is a little bit easier to digest, that might not stay with us for as long. Now, in certain situations, protein supplements, if they are easier to digest, may be the best approach for someone. So again, if someone has like a very low appetite, if they're on a certain medication, if someone's going through a particularly stressful time and they have no appetite, we would want to leverage those easier to digest protein sources. Or in these protein supplements specifically. And so I like to think of them as a tool. They are a tool in our toolkit that we can exercise and put into play when we need them, but we don't want to over rely on them. And so if you're like, I need to get 200 grams of protein, and that involves a lot of these supplements, well, again, we may be missing out on these other nutrients if we don't actually need to get 200 grams of protein. We can also sort of combine these protein supplements with whole foods. So a great example is a smoothie. If we're someone who maybe doesn't have a huge appetite in the morning, or if we just need something quick that's easy to digest, maybe we're on the go, maybe we're, commuting, maybe we don't have time to sort of sit down and eat something like a protein smoothie where we're taking a protein powder, but we're combining that with maybe some frozen fruit, some frozen veggies, some healthy fat, like some nut butter or avocado or nuts and seeds. Again, we're sort of taking that supplement and combining it with these whole food sources. So in that instance, I wouldn't say that the protein supplement is displacing real whole foods. And again, having a protein bar, shake, powder, I'm not saying that that's not something that someone could do every single day and have that balance, but we just want to look and see, okay, is this person's use of these supplements actually crowding out these other nutrients? And do they need this supplement to meet their protein needs, or are they actually already getting sufficient protein? And it might be the case of we think more is inherently better. An application for a protein supplement is if you're someone who works out and you actually don't have an appetite after, and maybe you're doing an early morning workout and you're sort of like running to get home, to shower, to get to work. Having something that's really easy to digest can support, again, that recovery from physical activity, and just sort of make reaching your protein goals a little bit more accessible. So it is quite nuanced, but okay. So what are some of the just like practical takeaways from this episode? I think, again, understanding your individual protein needs is a great starting point. So we can see, are you someone who needs to bring in more protein, or are you actually meeting your protein needs, maybe even having a little bit too much, and we want to make sure that we're not crowding out these other nutrients. I think taking a look at how your protein is dispersed throughout the day and how that relates to your appetite can be helpful as well. If you feel like you're consistently really, really hungry at night, or if you struggle with overeating at night, maybe just getting curious and asking yourself, am I getting enough protein earlier in the day? And would I like to change this? Can also just be a helpful strategy to consider. As far as building our meals go, we want to make sure that we are incorporating plenty of plant-based foods. So again, those fruits and vegetables. General framework for building our meals. This is called the Balanced Plate Framework. You've probably heard of this or seen this, where we focus on roughly a quarter of a plate of protein, a half a plate of non-starchy vegetables. So these are just going to be, most vegetables that are relatively lower in carbohydrates. So a non-starchy veggie would be something like broccoli, whereas a starchy veggie would be something like a sweet potato. So quarter plate protein, half a plate of non-starchy veggies, and then roughly a quarter of a plate of carbs. That can be a helpful visual to sort of take a look and see, am I at least getting a mix of these different food groups and nutrients at most of my meals, or are my meals really, really protein heavy? And then last but not least, I think using protein supplements strategically. If you notice, oh wow, I'm having 3 or 4 protein bars a day, but I'm getting plenty of protein in my meals, maybe we could sort of swap out those snacks for other foods that are going to help you meet these other nutrient needs like fiber, healthy fats, and carbs. So as a reminder, if you want to take a look at that blog post on protein and tips for increasing your protein intake, or if you'd like to download my free high protein food guide, you can check both of those things out in the show notes. There are links there. And then if you have a request for a future episode, or if you have feedback on the podcast, feel free to fill out the feedback form linked in the show notes as well. All right, that's it for today, and thanks so much for listening.